Hello, everybody, and welcome to the British Institute at Ankara's first lecture of the year. We're very pleased to be starting the season with this hybrid lecture by Dr. Dries Daems. Before I introduce the speaker, however, I will just want to briefly mention a couple of things about the BIA. As we move into the new year, we'd like to remind you how important your membership or even donations are to us, because as a charity, we rely very much on the support of our members. If you'd like to support the Institute and its facilities, please do consider to become a member, and you can find more information by scanning the QR code on the screen. I would also like to warmly welcome everybody joining us today. There is a lot of Bilkent University here, both those here in the room and those joining online. So whether it's evening, morning, and lunchtime, all very welcome. So if you're attending remotely, please use the Q&A function to send in your questions, and we'll come back to them at the end of the lecture. For those of you here in person, you're very lucky today because we are going to have a demonstration of the 3D scanning process about which Dries will be talking to us. And then afterwards, we will also have a small wine reception. So sorry to all of you online, but there are some perks to being here. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce our first speaker of the year, Dr. Dries Daems, who is an archaeologist and is currently assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, the Free University of Amsterdam. But he has previously held positions as assistant professor at Middle East Technical University here in Ankara. He wrote his PhD while he had a scholarship of the Scientific Research Flanders Fund. He was a fellow at Anamet in Koç University, and he was guest professor at the University of Helsinki. He's taken part in fieldwork in Turkey at Sagalassos, but also at Türkmen Karahöyük, and I think that half of the team of Türkmen Karahöyük is at the moment here in the Institute, at Komama, as well as in Cyprus, Jordan, and in Greece. Dries is working on the Iron Age to the Hellenistic Mediterranean, and his research interests are very wide-ranging and include social complexity, urbanism, connectivity, and information exchange, artisanal production, and human-environment interactions. He brings these together using approaches such as complexity theory, computational modeling, network science, and pottery studies. So his book, Social Complexity and Complex Systems in Archaeology, was published by Routledge in 2021. And a copy is available here in the BIA library, so on the second floor of the Institute. So if you like to look at it, you know where to find it. So we are very much looking forward, I think, to this lecture tonight, Digital Approaches to Hellenistic Pottery, Modeling Material Networks. So please join me in welcome Dries Daems. And in the lecture, he will present some results of recent work on Hellenistic pottery from Anatolia, combining tried and tested methods in material studies with innovative digital approaches. So Dries, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lit, for the introduction. I'm gonna see if I can this. All right. So let's see. I'm gonna also check my own time. This is, as some of you may know, my Achilles heel is timekeeping, so I'm also looking to the organizers here to keep me on track. All right, so thank you very much, everyone here in the room and online, for joining us in this lecture. I'm very happy to be here. Thank to the British Institute for hosting us here in the last 2 weeks, and also for organizing this lecture. It's my pleasure to stand in front of you here today to talk a bit about a variety of things that I've been doing in my work in recent years, mostly revolving Hellenistic pottery, although we're not only exclusively going to see Hellenistic pottery today necessarily, but always looking at certain digital approaches to do so. And rather than presenting a whole lot of finished case studies or finished pieces of work, a lot of things, these things are also still ongoing or are still being developed. So one of the projects that I'm going to talk about, we are doing here at the Institute, or working on here in the Institute at this very moment, which involves the 3D scanning. As Lut already indicated, there will be a demonstration about that at the end of the lecture. So I'm going to show a few things that I've been doing there. Before really jumping into the material itself, just very briefly about the Hellenistic period and why I am so interested in the Hellenistic period at large. It's a period where there's this presumed spread of the Hellenistic koine, you know, a shared set of ideas, material culture, architecture, iconography, statuary, literacy, language, and material culture as well. In a way that, and of course, a lot of these things have been worked on, and rather than thinking about one encompassing koine that covers this entire area from Greece to the Indus Valley in one covering blanket, as it were. We're talking not so much about a global approach, as it were, but rather as a global approach, just to use that terminology. So the implementation, the enactment of cultural practices and traditions within local and regional contexts. But still, it is a period of almost unprecedented patterns of connectivity interaction. There's lots of mobility throughout a broader region than ever before. There's trade and exchange happening. There's interstate competition, but also cooperation, interaction, and exchange going on. So it's a very fascinating period. It's a period in which a lot of things are happening. And since I am interested very much in these ideas of interaction, connectivity, exchange of information, it's also, for me, a very logical period to work on. And I'm not the only one to do so. So people have been, oh, there was one more. People have been working on the idea of interaction and information exchange in the Hellenistic and also the early Roman periods through the lens of, for example, network science, network analysis, which is something I'll be talking about a bit today as well, to explore things such as polis networks, networks of political cooperation and interaction, or imperial networks of the usage of power and the coverage of space by the imperial administration, or the exchange of material culture in networks of trade and exchange. All of this stuff is ongoing. And these are just three examples that I want to use to illustrate that a lot of these things are going on, and this is very much a vibrant research field. So what I want to do today basically is talk about a couple of case studies, if timing allows, 4 case studies in total, in which I'm going to talk about modeling. Talking about modeling or otherwise exploring, visualizing, and analyzing material networks on a variety of scales. So I'm going to be talking about stuff happening in the Eastern Mediterranean or Anatolia and the Levant to start with, all the way down to the individual site level. It's going to be networks that are both spatially informed as well as spatially abstract, in the case of, for example, similarity material networks. Just to show the wide variety of options that we have with these kind of approaches, and to hopefully also stimulate some people in trying to adopt these kind of approaches for themselves. The first thing I want to talk about is this large-scale modeling of material culture across a very large area. And to do so, you need also a large data set. One of the few data sets that is available of such a size is the Icrates data set, so a data set on late Hellenistic and Roman imperial tableware shirts. 275 sites all across the Eastern Mediterranean are included. Almost 34,000 individual shirts are included. This is the monumental work of a good colleague, Philip Bess, in which we have a record of pottery productions, pottery distributions as well, going from about 200 BCE up to about 700 CE. Now that's a broad range, very broad range, and it also kind of goes beyond the period of time that I am specifically interested in myself. So that's why we need to adapt this huge data set and, as it were, slice out the periods of time that I'm interested in. Now, you cannot just take that data set and say, okay, we're going to have a endpoint and everything going beyond that endpoint, we drop, and everything before that endpoint, we take it as it is. That is a bit oversimplified because the chronologies of our pottery don't necessarily match the exact chronologies that we want to impose on them. So if we say we are interested in everything happening between 200 BCE and 50 BCE, then we need to kind of model our distribution based on the temporal pattern of the pottery itself. Otherwise, we're going to create artifacts into our temporal distribution. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just putting this out there, one, so that you know what kind of the methodological starting point is. Two, to kind of self-advertise for this, if I may say so myself, pretty cool paper that we published a couple of years ago, in which we present an exact methodological pipeline for how to do this time slicing. The methodology is fully openly available. All the scripts are there as well. So if you have a temporal distribution in your data set and you want to kind of lift out certain slices, then this paper will tell you exactly how to do that. We use that to kind of trace the effects of time averaging, so the mashing together of our temporal signatures of archaeological materials in networks and how that impacts actually the results of network analysis. But beyond that, I'm not going to talk too much about this here, because what we're interested in is actually what we can do with these time slices. And again, this is work that was published very recently, last year in JAS, in which we used that methodology to lift out two time slices from the Icarus data set, slice from 150 to 50 BCE and 50 BCE to 50 CE, to kind of see if we can trace these late Hellenistic, early Roman material networks across the Eastern Mediterranean. In this case study, we selected 28 sites. You see them here. We selected 5 pottery wares, the most dominant pottery wares in these time slices, which are ESA, ESB, ESC, yes, you guessed it, ESD, and ITS. So Eastern Sigillata, A to D, and Italian Terra Sigillata, just to kind of test the methodology a bit. And we then used, or the methodology specifically entailed a combination of least cost path and mutual information analysis. Now, I'm not going to talk about the results of this paper per se. Again, all of that is available and can be consulted online. I kind of want to apply that methodology to a subsequent case study, so one that you're not going to find in this paper per se, but in which I'm going to focus specifically on, it says here, Hellenistic and Roman Anatolia and Levant. In the interest of time, I'm mostly going to skip the results for the Roman period and focus on the Hellenistic period. Forgive me for that. It is all for a better cause. In which I'm going to talk about the same 5 wares, but a different selection of sites. So 33 sites. No, that's too far. 33 sites all across still the Eastern Mediterranean, but with a focus on Anatolia and the Levant. And then I'm going to apply 2 different methodological two methodological approaches. Least cost path analysis as a kind of way to introduce or assess a geographical baseline of assessment. So what does least cost path analysis do? It basically says, well, we have a bunch of sites here, and we're going to let an algorithm seek for the most efficient pathway to go from A to B. And I'm going to do this across the Mediterranean for all of these sites, basically to say, look, how easy is it to move from A to B? And that's important because if we want to assess the distribution of material culture, we kind of have to make, or at least weigh that distribution against how easy it is to move across the landscape. If we know that site A is an important production center and it's easy to go from A to B, then our null hypothesis, as it were, has to be, well, we kind of expect a lot of material from A to B at B as well. If it's difficult to go from A to B, well, then we could say, regardless of how important this production center is, it is possible that that material is not going to be found at site B. And therefore, if we do find it at site B, that is something that goes against our null hypothesis, and we can look into factors of explaining. Explaining those factors, that's going to be the role of, or at least where we're going to use the mutual information part. Mutual information is a analysis type that helps us kind of untangle complex data patterns. No worry, I'm going to go into more detail on that later on, just to show you the first step. So we have here our least cost network, which I created based on a combination of existing networks, just to make things easy for myself, basically, and to show the validity of the approach. I used the combination of the Roman roads dataset and the Orbis geospatial model, in which there is a combination of terrestrial and maritime routes already available. I basically model my sites as part of that, and I create a network, which is also visualized in a slightly more coarse resolution here, in which I basically explore, well, okay, how easy is it to move from A to B? How easy is it to go from one site to another? And that, basically, those networks, those roads, I transform into what we call a cost matrix. This is the exact same thing. This is just an abstract representation in which we see the connection, the costs between any given site in our dataset. Now, the main thing to take away from this is that this kind of shows the importance of intermediary nodes. We see a generally fairly accessible network in which it's not extremely difficult to move from any point to any other point, but we do have an important role in certain intermediary nodes, such as in southwestern Anatolia, such as in Cyprus, in holding that network together. If we leave those intermediary nodes out of the network, it does become very difficult to actually travel with a relative ease across this entire network. But basically, this shows us that we have a good baseline of geographical connectivity. We have a good foundation for the model that we can then start comparing our mutual information with. Now, mutual information, I assume, is a term that is not so familiar in the audience here. It is not so familiar with archaeologists in general, because it's also not often applied in archaeology. Mutual information is very simply illustrated through this. Now, for those of you who have an allergy for mathematics, don't worry. This is the first and only formula you're going to see today. No problem. Basically, what mutual information does is it shows you the dependence between, or it assesses the dependence between variables. In this case, we have wares that are present at given sites, right? We have certain types of pottery, and they may or they may not be present at a given site. Now, all you do is you take this, put it into this little formula. We calculate what we call the joint probability and the marginal probability, and you get a certain value for each combination of wares given a given site. I can, if people are specifically interested in how the calculation of the joint and the marginal probability works, you can ask me afterwards. I have a couple of slides prepared, but at the very end of the talk, that I can show you to show you exactly how that works. Since I assume that this is not the case for most people, I am going to leave the details and basically say that when we have this value, basically, this is a value from low to high, giving us indications of the dependence between variables. So if we know the state or the presence of one variable, let's say the presence of ESA, then if you have a high mutual information value between those wares, the presence of ESA, let's say, and ESB is codependent. So you have ESA, then we can actually be quite certain that ESB should also be present at that second site if they have a high mutual information value in between them. If the mutual information value is low, it means that they're independent signatures, that the presence of ESA has no bearing whatsoever on the presence of ESB. That's basically what this means. So if we then use those MI values and we compare them to the cost values and we throw them in a matrix such as this. So here we have a matrix in which we show the mutual information value between any given site over the cost between those two sites. So basically what this shows, since the values are low here in this color spectrum, high in this color spectrum, it shows that the overall values are fairly low. We have left the Roman slice, left the Hellenistic slice, sorry, and right the Roman slice. Basically what this shows is that geography is a kind of a big leveler. Geography is kind of pushing things in or flattening things out, giving our information signatures. So that's interesting because it means that we would expect, on the whole, the role of geography to be quite important. But that's not necessarily what we see when we go into the detail of the mutual information values themselves. So I'm going to just show a few things that we have seen in these values based or just visualize them on the maps. There are actual numbers behind them, which I'm happy to share later on if you want. But what we see is that for the Hellenistic period, there is a fairly high degree of shared high mutual information in this area of, let's say, northern Levant, southern Anatolia, which is matching some of the stuff that we already know. There's lots of research being done on the existence of the so-called Anatolian Levantine pottery coinage in different periods of time, going from the Iron Age to the late Roman times. So the fact that our signature or our mutual information pattern captures the signature to an extent, that's interesting. When we look at the mutual information given a certain given the geographic cost factors, then we see even a smaller subgroup that seems to knit quite together. And we have mostly these sites in the northern and the mid to southern Levant, as well as Kition here in Cyprus, which I've like between brackets put this as a Seleucid cluster in the sense that these are a group of sites that for the period of times starting from the 2nd century BCE were part of the same Seleucid heartland in this area here. I put it between brackets because I don't want to overstate our interpretation. We're not seeing high mutual information values necessarily because these are sites that belong to the Seleucid Empire. But it's interesting that these sites can be seen as being fairly similar or sharing a dependent signature in their material culture, which, to a degree can be mapped perhaps on the presence of shared political structures. Same for the, again, what I put in between brackets, so-called Ptolemaic cluster, which is interesting because I've, in the analysis, purposely included also Alexandria as a site, even though it's not necessarily particularly relevant for what's happening here. Expectedly, it has a fairly low mutual information value with pretty much every site in the dataset, except a couple here on the east coast, specifically Troy, Ephesus, and I think Labronda as well, which, well, if we, we know that the Ptolemies were present in the area for quite a significant amount of time. So would that perhaps then be a reflection of a kind of shared sense of material culture across these areas? Is a very, very light suggestion I would want to make, but again, which I would not want to overstate because, for example, Halicarnassus, which we know to be under Ptolemaic rule for a period of time, is also included in the data set, does not share this mutual information pattern. So again, not wanting to overstate what we're finding in these in our results. And there are some indications that we are kind of picking up or tracing the outlines of some historical trajectories here and there. For the Roman period, as I said, I am going to largely gloss over these, except for the fact that what we see is like an expansion of this coinage. The idea that more and more sites are starting to share a medium level of mutual information. There is a minimum degree of shared material culture going on at these sites, which we didn't have before, which is kind of pushing this zone of interaction beyond what we had before. This is basically just a graph to kind of illustrate what is causing the high mutual information, because this is a metric that can be caused both by the high co-presence as a high absence of material culture. If ESA and ESB, in a fictional example, never co-occur, then the absence, in this sense, is also has a high predicting value. Right? In this case, though, we have shown where the mutual information is coming from. Does it come from the co-occurrence of the wares or the absence of the wares? And the lighter colors basically indicate co-occurrence. So clearly, this is the Hellenistic slice. The high mutual information is only caused by high co-occurrence of wares. So it's clear that this is the case that it is the case that it's a shared material culture that is producing the patterns that we see for the Hellenistic time slice. In this case, it's really the push of the early onset of ESA as a mass production product across a lot of sites that is generating the information that we have for that time slice. I'm not going to go into too much detail for these figures because I do want to move on to the next case studies. And there's a lot of information in here. These are figures that show for any given combination of sites, the mutual information value for the Hellenistic period, mutual information value for the Roman period, and the cost factor between those sites. So the fact that you see a lot of things happening means that there's not a uniform signature across that period or across that area, I should say. But one of the main things to take away from this is that basically there is a high degree of discontinuity except for the very largest sites in our data set. So continuity from Hellenistic to the Roman period is really mostly concentrated on the larger sites, does not extend too much on the smaller sites in our data set, which I think is a quite interesting observation. Now, first set of conclusions. What this kind of approach tries to do is use different methodological approaches to assess, on the one hand, geographic networks, and on the other hand, what you could call deviations from those geographic networks. So everything that can be potentially related to social, political, economic factors. It's a useful methodology because it allows us to explore clusters of sites as well as connections between those clusters and how we can potentially trace the generation of connectivity. It kind of seems that we can find some traces of historical trajectories in our results, but we have to watch out that we're not over-interpreting these networks. We have to also be aware of potential temporal mismatches in our data. The potential outline of Ptolemaic cluster that I talked about earlier, we have to take into account that the Ptolemaic possession in that area actually predates the material culture that we're using to assess and interpret our dynamics here. So obviously, we're not going to overinterpret what we are finding in that regard. And the fact that we need, and this is something I will come back later on as well, we need kind of a multi-proxy approach as well. We're using just pottery and only a limited set of pottery at that to say a lot. That's why I'm also being very careful to delineate how far I want to go. Obviously, we need more sets of data to be included in this. That's also why I think this kind of approach can be useful for other people to enter the picture and to enrich the picture that we have and trying to expand what we know and what we can say. But I will say that I do think, I'm very convinced that this kind of approach has is very high potential and really shows already some high potential outlines for exploring these kind of convergences, discrepancies in connectivity patterns, and especially in distinguishing between, on the one hand, these geographical factors, and then anything that can help us explain deviations from that. That was the big scale. So from here, let's zoom in a bit. Let's zoom in on a couple of case studies, and I'm going to focus particularly on two case studies, Sagalassos and Turkmenkarayük. Starting with Sagalassos. You see a picture of a very beautiful theater here, which postdates the period of interest, so I'm not going to talk about any of that at all. And the first case study I want to talk about is material similarity networks. So we're going to move from the geographically explicit to the geographically abstract. And I'm going to kind of show an approach how to build shape-based approaches to functional typologies. It's something that's still very much in preparation. So we're going to start from the idea that we're going to take a basic typochronology in Iron Age to Hellenistic material and see if we can expand or at least show a methodological approach to start expanding that. The results in regards to interpretation is still very much limited. But seeing if we can lay the foundation here to explore potential communities of practice that can be hopefully traced through morphological and shape-based differences. To do so, we're not going to include Sagalassos alone, but a range of sites and material from those sites in the area. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail there. But basically, we start from very basic typological classification. We have our functional groups. Within those functional groups, we have our types. So we have our cups, we have our bowls, our dishes, etc. Within the cups, we have chimerid cups, we have mastoid, whatever, incurving rim bowls, plain rim bowls, you have it. This is our starting point. These are the labels that we're going to give to our data records, and then we're going to feed into the methodological pipeline, into the model that we're going to be presenting. These kind of, what we have here, 2D drawings of our pottery are also the input data for a pipeline for what we call structured data creation. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to build, or what we have done together with my colleague Tanai Kafezaki, we're going to let the algorithm extract a whole set of parameters from each individual drawing. And if you have worked with pottery or any kind of material culture, for that matter, in which you have to build a kind of topology, then you know that as material specialists, we tend to focus on a limited set of variables. In case of pottery, things like diameter, shape of the rim, wall thickness, orientation, these are some of the more important ones. But you can't take too many into account, right? You can take like a handful, 10 maybe, if you want to be very precise in your work. But at some point, if you try to include more and more parameters, you're just, that's where madness lies. An algorithm does not have that issue. With the algorithm that we've built, or that my colleague Danai has built, I should say, we can take up to, or at least over 100 parameters, variables into account, depending on the type of image that it is. And we're going to use the input of each of those parameters to build a fuzzy descriptor of that individual data record. Basically, it's going to tell us not necessarily, oh, this is a cup and it is particular this specific type of cup. It's going to say with a degree of probability where in the functional spectrum or typological spectrum it would place it. It would then kind of use this to, and I'm not going to go into too much detail as to the different methodological steps. Again, if you're very interested in the methodology, I have the reference down here in which all of that has been laid out, demonstrated, and again, all of the code and even an interactive app to do this for yourself is made available. So basically what we have a structured data table that we're going to transform into a distance matrix, transform on the one hand into what we call an adjacency matrix, and identify a number of clusters that we want to explore. And all of that is going to basically result into this, a network of material similarity. So this is, in the end, just a network representation of the data set that we put into. What was the data set that we put into? Drawings. So each node in the network is an individual drawing or an individual shirt, as it were. And our algorithm has grouped all of these shirts based on how similar they actually are. So more similar shirts are placed more closely together, more dissimilar shirts are placed further away from each other, and we have identified groups, clusters, that the algorithm thinks could be useful to interpret this network. That's basically it. So there's a couple of things that we are doing with this. On the one hand, since we are, as I said, using labeled finds, so labeled drawings as our input data, but if we would extend that data set and include a bunch of drawings that we haven't labeled, for example, one of the things that if we have such an unlabeled find is use this network to automatically add labels to them. So if we have this nice little bowl here and it is integrated into an existing network, we're going to show, or the algorithm is going to show suggestions based on the most similar, most closely located parts of the network. Well, this bowl, nice bowl that you have here, looks a bit like this bowl. Do you agree that these labels should be, or which of these labels, if they're multiple, should be transposed to this one, basically? So it's actually a very useful tool to start labeling material culture, especially for a non-specialist, if you're not familiar with the material itself. It can assess consistency in your labels. So you could say, let's take out all of the incurving rim balls, or let's say incurving rim balls, B170s in our typology, and see how consistent each of those are. We could have what we call an envelope, an overlay of these images, and show what is the degree of fuzziness in the orientation of the rim, and do we see clusters in our metrics, or do we see outliers or different modes in that distribution that can point towards this class, this category, perhaps being not as tightly defined as we would like. So this can help you to assess the robustness of your typologies. We built or Danai has built a interactive R Shiny app. So it's using the R programming language to build a small application that you can run on your own machine. So it doesn't work necessarily with an internet connection, in which you can explore all of this in an interactive way. And so we're using this to kind of think our way through this material to see whether the categories that I've defined in our typology, typochronology that we started with, whether that is robust or not, whether those actually work, whether there is new categories to be defined, whether I should move or relabel part of that assemblage. Some of the things we've already seen is that just by having these things in a network representation already helps in exploring some of the fuzzy edges of that data set and seeing if and helps us kind of rethinking the way that we approach this material. We see a general concordance, in which I'm pretty happy with, between the preliminary typology and the outcomes of the network. So at large, we see my types represented by specific clusters, specific groups within the network. So at least there seems to be some basis to what I'm doing, which is always nice to kind of get that feedback, I guess. We identified a number of key shapes that connects the cluster. So type of a shape of rim, let's say, that is very similar between, let's say, plates and craters, which is something that happens quite often. Those intermediary groups actually do appear in intermediary locations in the network as well. And we also see the other side of things, that there are just groups where it's very difficult to make distinctions. So certain types of bowls and dishes, or cups and bowls, for example, that are very difficult to differentiate, also seem to be grouped within the same clusters by the network. So also the algorithm has some difficulty in breaking those apart, which also shows that this is something that that is going to be retained regardless of which approach you're going to use anyways. All right, conclusions of the second section, still good on time. So this kind of approach allows us to enhance what we're doing with the material study at large. Allows us to zoom in to different aspects of the material through an interactive inspection. It's very much a data-driven approach. There are no assumptions being made, no theoretical starting points being made in how we are going to cluster and divide this material culture. So at the very least, it can help as a kind of baseline assessment of the material and the data set that you have in front of you. It maps typologies as graphs, giving this kind of different perspective, which can be very useful to look at your material and trying to find new elements, as well as spot inconsistencies and explore these multiple modes within your individual groups. So if you have a clear multimodal distribution of your parameters, that gives you a good indication that, well, something is going on here, and we have to kind of look at those categories and maybe subdivide into multiple groups, or at least multiple types or variants. Allows us to assess the robustness of our classifications, and thus also formulate hypotheses for specialist interpretation. Note that all of these are things that you can only do in a kind of interactive and iterative way with a material specialist involved. And this is something that I do want to emphasize, because for a lot of people who see these kind of approaches, the first fear or worry that they have as well, are you building this to replace specialists, to let others do the work and make sure that the specialist doesn't need to be involved anymore? And then to those people, I always have to say, well, no, sorry, that's never going to happen. You're always going to need the specialist that knows the material to look at the outcomes, to iteratively interpret what is going on here, trying to find explanations and also suggest improvements and work on things. And that's always going to happen. So people, don't fire your specialists. On the contrary, hire more specialists. We need them, and get them involved with your projects. All right. Third case study, and we're moving away from Sagalassos to Turkmenkarayük. And just for people who may have forgotten, Turkmenkarayük, we're located here. At this site, which we recently, last couple of years, have started excavating, we have found an absolutely fantastic assemblage of Hellenistic pottery. So we have our molded bowls, we have our painted, banded painted pottery, we have entire specimens, entire vessels popping up, a wide range of shapes, a wide range of wares. So the ideal setup, ideal kind of assemblage to try and do some new things. So yes, we are working on the typologies of this site. Yes, we're working on exploring patterns of distribution and trade, exchange, etc. But we thought that this would be an ideal starting point, this richness of material culture, to try something that a few people have tried, but not really successfully, but having a kind of different twist on it, which is to use 3D models of the material to inform or support generative machine learning models for archaeological ceramics. So this is a project funded by the NWO, a collaboration between myself from Vrije Amsterdam, the 4D Research Lab, of which Mason here is a representative today, and a company called 3D Universum, in which we basically want to expand the approach from the previous case study, remember, where you use the 2D drawings as an input data for algorithms to start extracting parameters. Basically, what I want to do is take these 3D models and do pretty much the same thing. Use them as input data to generate ultimately these kind of similarity networks, approaches to explore similarity and dissimilarity in material culture. We see here Mason at work with the method that we're using, which is called structured light scanning. Basically, we have this kind of iron-like machinery that we use to, and that we make very flashy things with, or do very flashy things with. It doesn't really work. Okay, fine. To generate these eerie looking things, which through a set of processing steps is gradually turned into a 3D model in which we capture mostly, first and foremost, the morphological aspects of it, which we also can assign kind of texture to make it look a bit pretty, especially in communication purposes. But the purpose, first and foremost, is to capture the morphology. That's all I'm going to say about the process. Mason will say much more things about that in a way better way than I can. But basically, we're going to use the morphological properties of this 3D model to explore or build a generative machine learning pipeline. Now, this is very much work in progress, right? We are here at the British Institute, and we've been here for the last 2 weeks almost, to do basically the data generation, data capturing of our project. So we have been scanning a whole lot of materials from the excavations, as well from the collections here, that we're going to then use as input data for our pipeline, which is still being developed. So this is our colleague that Cesar Carraol, who is still working on this, but in which basically the idea is to take a set of pre-trained deep learning models, specifically pre-trained on 3D data, use them to generate what they call in the terminology latent representations, so a kind of abstract setting of all of the geometric morphological properties of the material, and then use a combination of unsupervised clustering and similarity analysis to generate the same kind of networks that have been shown before. So on the one hand, letting the algorithm do its thing, trying to distill patterns from it, and then also tie that to an expert evaluation. So the pottery specialist, me, looking at the networks and saying like, okay, is this something we can actually make sense of, or do we need to redo some steps or try to figure out more things about this material before we have things that actually make sense. This is why I said we're doing something with a twist. Others have tried the general pipeline that we have here as well, but there the outcome or the intended outcome was always classification. So basically putting in a image or a drawing of a pot or whatever and getting out an answer, getting out, oh, this is this type and it was made in this site, it was distributed from this point in time until that point in time. And what we've seen so far is that does not work. That level of specificity does not work because we do not have in archaeology the data sets that are encompassing large enough to really get to that level of interpretation. That's why And again, I will state this just to make sure that everybody gets it. That's why the expert always needs to be involved. What we're doing is we're trying to find patterns. And we're going to try to find them in such a way that those patterns make sense to the expert that is actually involved in that project. So basically, would give us kind of similar thing. This is a hypothetical mock-up in which we have our pieces that are placed together in similarity networks based on how similar they look to each other. So if we have a plate with just a ring base or a stamped plate, well, they're going to be found fairly close together, but not necessarily next to each other. Our molded pieces here will be found close to each other. And in that way, we're going to try to create this kind of a network and try to assess their similarity. Or they might not be found together all together, and we have to find out why the model is doing that, which is also part of the fun, of course. Right. So the conclusions for our third section basically are the same as the second section. So all of the points that I raised there are important here as well. I will just add that I think, and this is also why we started this project, this could be a very interesting approach to kind of, again, move up from the site level. So we've moved from this large-scale level down to the sites where we're looking at individual pieces and what we can find regarding similarity, dissimilarity. I think that this is a good approach to eventually start moving up and look not only at individual sites, but also on how material culture actually connects across sites, across a large area. This is a kind of very basic network mock-up that I did based on the pottery material of Sagalassos. So what I did basically looked as every pottery specialist will do. I have my typology, I have my classifications, and I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to look in books, and I'm going to see, well, where do I find other stuff that looks like my stuff, right? And then you can say, like, look, and this is going through time, whatever, doesn't particularly matter. We have a type of material, and at a given point in time, this type is found at these sites, and a shared type basically is a shared connection in the network. And, you know, we let the network fly, and you see, nice stuff, whatever. This is the basic thing. This is what we do, right? And this is important. This is something that helps us explore patterns of potential interaction or where similar types of material culture can be found. But I think that when we use this kind of 3D, very high resolution captures of the morphological parameters of our material, we actually have a kind of formal basis to build these kind of networks, the same kind of networks that we're building as material specialists anyway, but then see where those patterns bring us when we are not, when they're not generated from our interpretation, when it's a data-driven approach rather than an interpretive approach. And I think that that could be a very interesting approach to apply to a wide range of sites in order to see where these networks are actually shaping up and whether they match also the networks we've been thinking about in the first place. Also helps us to kind of build a more, or could potentially help us to build a more extensive data set where we combine these two approaches, these two case studies that I've been outlining, using, for example, the 3D models as kind of avatars, but obviously not everyone can make 3D models. Time and money restraints are there for everyone, but maybe we can use existing 2D drawings and link them to our 3D models, but still use those as tagged input data for our machine learning as a way to augment our data sets and increase and augment therefore also the resolution of our networks. Something that could be very useful, I think, going into the future as more people are hopefully looking into the options of this approach. And finally, I can be very quick, don't worry. Final case study is basically an extension of what we did with the 3D scanning, and it's kind of a happenstance in the sense that we were at Turpen over the summer. We were modeling, scanning a whole bunch of material. And basically, I told our colleagues of the 4D Research Lab, well, I'm not particularly interested in the mold-made bowls for the project of the machine learning algorithm, but they're pretty. Right? And making 3D models of pretty things is always useful because at the very least you have something nice to, visual things for outreach. It's also a good thing actually to test the scanning outcomes and how well it works in capturing really the details of this stuff. So I thought, well, let's take a few things, a few pieces in a fairly rich assemblage of molded balls that we have, and see what they look like. And so we were going through that material, and as I was studying the material anyways, I found that in the 70 pieces, 70 about pieces that we have 5 in which we see this motif, eagle motif. And as I started looking at these things, I kind of started to think, they look very similar. They look really, really similar. So one of the ideas that popped up at that point is, well, could we use the 3D scans to see how similar they actually are? And would it be, this was our wild suggestion, could it be that these are actually made with the same stamp? Which is something that is very difficult to actually identify and prove just using like traditional methodologies. So, well, we had the scanner there, we had the people there. We made the scans, so we made 3D models of each shirt. And then my colleague Jette Waage had the very interesting idea, well, what if we use the point clouds of these shirts and treat them basically as a digital surface map, as you would do with, for example, LiDAR analysis. You're going to analyze differences in topography, but rather than in the landscape, really on the very small scale of the individual shirt. Okay, let's try. So we created point clouds for each of the models, we overlaid them, and we started comparing. So here we have a kind of, you could call it a difference image between our two digital surface models, in which we overlay and explore the degree of difference between the two point clouds. Negative differences are in black, positive differences in orange. This is a difference model that takes into account the curvature of the shirt. And the curvature of the shirt is important because that is going to, like the position of the stamp is going to, and the force in which it is applied by the potter is going to have an impact in how the relief is actually coming out. So these are things that we need to take into account. When we take into account that curvature and we show the degree of differences between the two different point clouds, we see that, well, for the core of the stamp, quite similar. The differences between our point clouds are very minimal, but on either side there is a difference. That actually points that, or suggests that the tilt, the curvature of the application of the stamp is something that's impacting our differences that we observe in our point clouds. So that's why we did the same thing again, but then kind of took out the curvature, like projected it as if it were on a flat surface, which is something you can do with these kind of approaches. And then suddenly you see a very even change. You see the positive changes here, or going towards positive changes here. You see a much more even transition across that entire area. If we visualize this here in the histogram and here on the location of the stamps itself, all of the differences in the stamp of the figure of the eagle itself are the absolute minimal differences. We're looking at less than 1 millimeter as an average difference. So such a degree of morphological similarity, which is a very, very strong indicator that we're actually working with the same stamp here. So we were very thrilled with this finding, something that we wrote up in a publication the last couple of weeks. We submitted it, it's under review. Hopefully we'll have all of that out, as well as the entire methodological pipeline for this. So this is something that we hope people are going to apply as well. So conclusions for our fourth section. This high degree of morphological similarity seems to suggest that we're working with the same kind of stamp. It could suggest, or it strongly suggests that we're working perhaps with the same, or probably with the same artisan within the same workshop. The state of research at the moment at Turkmenkariok is such that we don't know whether production took place at the site itself, but it does give an additional indication that it might have. I mean, to have out of 70 pieces found in the site, with 5 having the same motif, and then 2 out of 5 sharing the same stamp, is a huge degree of well, luck. Or is it? Is this a lucky match, or does it show that this kind of approach really has a lot of potential to look into, or to be applied on a large scale, and to see to use as an indication or further exploration of patterns of production, regardless of whether we find the remains of a workshop or not. I think it does show that this kind of approach has a lot of potential. I don't think it is mere luck that we found already a match in such a small sample. So I think there's lots more to be explored and to be found out over there. We're kind of treating this as it were some form of virtual experimental archaeology, right? We're taking our two images and we're going to overlay them and we're going to see how we can compare and juxtapose these images. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking through, because our first idea was, well, what if we could use the 3D scans and like make a stamp, and we try to do some experimental archaeology by applying stamps to clay, etc. But in the end, this is a virtual way of doing very much the same thing, exploring these potentials of similarity, which I think could be very, very, very cool to apply in other cases as well. We use this 3D environment as a kind of workbench, doing iterative visualization, testing, trying first with curvature, then without curvature. What are the outcomes? What gives the best results? Where are the things that make sense? So again, something that I've been trying to outline throughout the case studies that I've presented here, the usage of digital approaches as a kind of testing workbench, a way of looking through and exploring hypotheses. And then finally, my real conclusions, my last slide of the day. So all of these case studies basically are, I hope, good examples of using digital approaches as these kind of alternative lenses for traditional materials, traditional ways of approaching materials, and enhancing the things that we do as archaeologists, right? And I really do mean enhancing, because again, this is not a matter of building digital workflows that replaces an expert. It's really all examples of this kind of iterative expert-system interaction. It's the interaction between the digital system and the expert that's actually giving best results. I think network analysis within the overall range of digital approaches, because obviously I have limited myself to the stuff that I am working on, because this is the stuff that I find cool, basically. I think network analysis, beyond the fact that they're really cool, are very fruitful, because as archaeologists, we often are already thinking about these patterns of connection, interaction, right? Something that is, especially these days, very much at the fore of a lot of things that we do. And network analysis is something that just brings out the best of this kind of approach and builds kind of formal underpinning of the thinking, the way that we think already about things in the past. And the really cool thing is, well, we're just getting started. There's still so much to be explored. There's still so much potential of these kind of approaches. We have the data sets. We have the expertise. It's really a matter of trying these kind of approaches, and it's really not that difficult. Doing a basic network analysis just involves basically recreating your existing data set in network terms and then seeing what comes out of that and taking that as the first step in visualizing and analyzing things from a different perspective. We're only just getting started, and I really think that the next frontier, the next step to take in these kind of approaches is to bridge the kind of what I call multi-scalar approaches. So the case studies that I've shown you, yes, they range different scales. They go from Eastern Mediterranean to the individual site, but starting to bring those scales together in the same methodological approach, and network analysis does that. There is a whole field that's called multi-level network analysis, which other disciplines have been working with, but in archaeology hasn't been taken up yet, which I think can be very fruitful, as well as what you could call a multi-proxy approach, because again, we're talking about pottery in this case here, because, well, obviously pottery is cool, pottery is what I like to do, but there's a whole lot of other stuff out there as well. So if you're working with any kind of data in which morphological variability could be potentially meaningful for interpretation, and I state that very generically, purposefully, because that encompasses pretty much any data that we have, then these kind of approaches are useful for you. Network analysis is a useful approach to bring our materials together. And I think once we start doing that, once we start thinking across different scales, across different types of material category, that's where we're going to see our discipline really take a leap forward, moving on to the next level of interpretation and understanding. And I do hope that you all feel the same about that, and that have perhaps sparked a small inkling of inspiration in that. Thank you very much.
Dries, thank you very much. I think it's very good to see where pottery, whether you like it or not, can go and could go into the future. So thank you very much. Now, I'm sure that there are quite a lot of questions.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I'm just wondering whether you thought of including the material, the like petrographic analysis or something like that into this system, and how you think that would change or enhance your models.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Something I've been thinking about quite a lot. It's something that we're considering for the next step in these kind of approaches, right? So what I've been presenting in these kind of similarity networks, that is pure morphological similarity, right? So that doesn't even take into account the wears, right? You could have the same type of incurving rim bowl, and you can have that in a black gloss shirt or in a courseware shirt or whatever, doesn't matter, right? The approach as we have it does not differentiate between those. It will group the black gloss incurving rim bowl, or it could group the black gloss incurving rim bowl exactly next to one that is the exact same shape, but a completely different fabric or a completely different wear, right? Which has some advantages and some disadvantages. I think it's interesting to look at patterns of morphological similarity across the groups that we often find very important, right? If we publish our pottery, then what do you often see? A section on the black gloss pottery, a section on the red slipped pottery, a section on the courseware pottery, etc. But like the connections across those categories are very often disregarded. So I think this kind of approach already gives a good, way of solving that. That's one thing. The second thing is that, yes, these are important sets of information that can help us make sense of what we think we see. Having wear information or fabric information with petrographic data that allows us to group certain subsets of material regardless of their morphological similarity is a potential extension, enrichment of the kinds of input data that we use for these kind of generative machine learning models, for example. It's something that we're definitely considering. This is also why, together with the scanning that Mason is doing, I am also recording for each shirt what is the wear, what is the overall fabric, and then yes, petrography will be a next step to include also into that analysis. And can we use that also as input parameters and see how that changes the picture? And can we, by, as it were, toggling layers, inputting petrography on the one hand or not inputting it, and what are the outcomes of our model in each case? And so our different networks that are being generated, is that something that is really impacted by that specific data point or not? And therefore, what does this tell us about the material culture? I think would be a very interesting approach to explore in the future, and it will definitely be explored. Yes.
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Dries. One question online. What might happen if distributions of Hellenistic coins could be compared with those of ceramics?
Who knows? But that's the challenge, right? So one of the things that I'm very interested in to explore for the future is to bring, again, this multi-proxy approach, right? Using different sets of material and building networks based on those, and see how those networks actually intersect, interact, and otherwise can be compared. There's no way of knowing what will happen. But it's interesting to do these things anyways, because what you're going to find is that each set of networks with each individual proxy captures a different subset or a different component of aspects of connectivity and interaction at that point of time, right? And your coin networks will capture different patterns of connectivity and interaction than your pottery is going to have. Some of that will overlap, some of that will be the same economic networks that is driving the distribution of both. Some of it will be different. And exploring exactly how divergent or similar different types of networks actually are using different material proxies, that is the next step, and something that very few people are actually doing.
Any more questions? I have one. So in your last map of the data-driven approach rather than interpretive approaches, the line between, I mean, the connections between your two sides of examples was not exactly very thick. There doesn't seem to be that much, which is normal because you have the Taurus Mountains in between. But nevertheless, are the assemblages very different, or is it too early to say anything because Turkmen Karayük is a very new excavation, or is it really different traditions?
Yeah, good question. So the map, the network as I made, was really a kind of mock-up just to like illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. It does reflect the actual states of affairs of knowledge at Sagalassos, because it's a Sagalassos-centric network. And disclaimer, it was made before the Turkmen Karayük excavation started.
I was wondering about that already, yes.
But yeah, I mean, to like put that answer into context, when we actually have the material there would be a fair degree of connectivity between those sites because there is a shared material culture. But what you really see and what's kind of interesting is that in Sagalassos, it's only a very specific subset of the material. And even within something in the first version of the slides that I actually had included, but that I took out to keep time into consideration. What you see, even if you compare Saga to its immediate vicinity in the study area of the Sagalassos project, Sagalassos doesn't have a particularly rich material culture. There are other sites, especially in this pre-Roman periods, that have much richer material than Saga itself. So even there, it's nothing special. And still, it becomes the dominant site in that area, which is in and by itself already an interesting observation that needs some interpretation and explanation. But yeah, so that's something that you would really see also with the material with Turkmen, which at the same period of time is much richer, much more vibrant than what we have at Sagalassos.
I'm sure the excavation director will be very happy to hear that, but any other questions? Otherwise, we are now, for those of us here in the room, those of you who are interested in a demonstration of how to make the 3D scanning and everything, we can do that now. For those of you online, thank you very much for joining us, and see you in a few weeks when we have the next very different lecture. So keep an eye on the BIA announcements. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dries. It was starting in Flemish there at the moment. You might have heard. Let's not do that. But thank you very much. I think everybody enjoyed it, and thanks for showing us the future of ceramic research.
Some of it.
Thank you. Some of it. Well, not an unimportant part. Let's do that way.